Okay, so today we're going to be looking at target 6. We are going to be graphing the sine graph, and we're going to be changing the amplitude and the period. So first we have to remember just the parent function of the sine graph. If you look at sine of 0, you get 0. If you look at sine of pi over 2, that gives you 1. Sine of pi is 0. Sine of 3 pi over 2 is at -1, and sine of 2 pi is at 0. Okay, so this is the parent function of our sine graph. So a couple of things to keep in mind. The period is 2 pi. The amplitude would be 1. And the midline would be at y equals 0. Okay, so the midline happens right here for the sine graph. Okay, so now we're going to take this parent function and we're going to start transforming it by playing with the amplitude and the period. So first we're going to use our graphing calculator and we're going to graph y equals 2 sine of x. So if we take our graphing calculator, so first let's type in the parent function. Okay, so first let's type in y equals sine of x to get our parent function. Okay. So we get something like this. Let's go ahead and change our window so it looks like what I just graphed. So our minimum x value will be 0. Our maximum x value will be 2 pi. So I'm only going to graph from 0 to 2 pi for right now. Our scale, we're counting by pi over 2. Our minimum y value will be -1. Our maximum y value will be +1. Okay, so now I'm going to hit graph. So we can see the parent function that I just sketched. Okay, so now I'm going to go to y equals, and now I'm going to type in y equals 2 sine of x. And now I'm going to hit graph. So as we see this new graph happening, we can see that our graph isn't really tall enough, meaning I need to go back and change my y values in the window. So if I go back to window, and I let my y values go from -2 to 2, there we go. So there's that blue parent function. And now here's y equals 2 sine of x. So what really happened here? What changed was the amplitude. The amplitude used to be 1. Now our amplitude is 2. Okay? So the amplitude is 2. So when I go to graph this, now instead of going from 1 to -1, I'm going from 2 to -2, but I have exactly the same graph happening. Okay, so here's 1, here's -1. So essentially this graph is twice as tall. Okay, so what would happen if I had -1/4 x? So remember that negative is going to give us a reflection over the x-axis. So in our parent graph, normally we start at 0, 0, and then we go up to the max. But that negative reflects it over the x-axis. So now I'm going to go down to the minimum value. Okay, so now my amplitude is 1/4, meaning I'm going to go between a y value of -1/4 and +1/4. Okay, then I'll be back up at 0, then I'm at my max, and then back to the midline. So something like that. So again, the negative reflects it over the x-axis. The 1/4 gives me the amplitude, so that's just telling me my minimum and maximum y values. Okay, so now we're going to make the 2 go inside the parentheses and kind of look at, well, how does that transform the graph? So if I go back to my calculator and I change this to be y equals sine of 2x. Okay, so the blue one's the parent graph. Now the red one's the transformed graph. So if you look at that red graph now, what has changed is the period has changed. Okay, so the period now equals, so if we look at this, let's see, our period now is pi. It only takes until pi for that pattern to repeat instead of 2 pi. So my period is pi. Okay, so if we, now my amplitude is still 1 here, so I still have a min and max of 1 and -1. But, let's see, I'm still starting at 0, 0. But now my period is pi. So it only takes until pi to get 1 period of that graph. Okay, and so if you went all the way out to 2 pi, you'd really have 2 cycles happening. Okay, so if I give you an equation y equals a times the sine of bx, a will give you the amplitude and b helps determine the period. Okay, so if I gave you the equation y equals sine of 2x, the a value is 1 and the b value is 2. Okay, so there is a formula to determine the period. You're always going to take 2 pi and divide it by the b value. So in this example we just looked at, if I take 2 pi and divide it by the b value of 2, that gives me pi. And that is what we just saw in our graphing calculator, that if I do y equals sine of 2x, the period is pi instead of 2 pi. Okay, so let's kind of put this all together. So if I look at the a value here, that's going to be 2. The b value here is pi. Since the a value is 2, that's giving me my amplitude. Okay, my midline for all of these right now is just going to be y equals 0. Okay, now let's look at the period. So the period is 2 pi divided by the b value of pi. So that means my period is 2. So that means my graph will go all the way out to an x value of 2. Okay, well, I've got 4 marks on my x-axis. So if I take the period of 2 and divide it by 4, that means I'm counting by halves. So here I'll have 1/2. Next I'll have 2 halves, which is 1. Here I'll have 3 halves. Then I'll have 4 halves, which is 2. Okay. I'm going to label my y-axis since my amplitude is 2. I'm going to go up 2 and down 2. And now I'm going to draw on this sine function. So it starts at 0, goes up to the max, back to 0, goes to its min, back to 0. Okay, so there's the graph of that function. Let's do one more. All right, so here we're going to say the a value is 3. We're not going to say it's -3. That negative is just going to reflect us over the x-axis. The b value here is 1/2. The amplitude is 3. It's always going to be the same as the a value. The period, we're going to take 2 pi and divide it by the b value of 1/2. So I'm taking 2 pi and I'm dividing it by 1/2. Remember that 2 pi divided by 1/2 is the same as 2 pi times the reciprocal of 1/2. Okay, so that will give me 4 pi. So my period is 4 pi. My midline, again, this will always be y equals 0 for right now. Okay, so now I'm going to get everything labeled on my graph. I'm going to go on my y-axis from 3 to -3. My period is 4 pi, so that means this last mark on my x-axis will be 4 pi. If I take that period and divide it by 4, because I have 4 tick marks here, that means I'm counting by pi. So this will be 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, and 4 pi. Okay? I have to remember here that I have -3. That negative, again, reflects me over the x-axis. So I still start at 0, 0, but then instead of going up to the maximum, it's going to go down to its minimum, back to 0, max, back to 0. Okay? So, at the end of this lesson, you should feel pretty confident identifying A and B, knowing how they affect the graph, and being able to sketch a graph of the sine functions as we change the A and the B value.